Let me tell you about the station first, because you need to understand what kind of place it was before you understand what happened there. Varath 9 wasn't a glamorous posting. Nobody came to Varath 9 because they wanted to. You came because the Bureau sent you, or because you were transiting to somewhere better, or because you'd run out of better options a long time ago. It sat at the junction of 3 shipping lanes in the outer helix, which sounds important until you realize that outer was doing a lot of heavy lifting in that description. We were far. Far from the core systems, far from the galactic assembly halls, far from anything that mattered in the political sense. What Varath 9 was busy. 14 species moved through our docking bays on any given cycle. Freighters, passenger liners, diplomatic transports, military convoys, refugee ships, all of it poured through our corridors like water through a cracked pipe. You couldn't walk 50 meters in the main transit hall without bumping into 3 different species arguing about customs fees, docking priority, or which food processor unit was theirs. I'd worked there for 11 cycles by the time this happened, long enough to stop noticing things that would have seemed strange to me once, long enough to develop what my supervisor, a stout Brannicky named Wheelos, called the exhaustion of the accustomed, long enough to look at almost anything and feel very little. Almost anything. The Galactic Combined Forces had a garrison on Varath 9. Small one, 42 soldiers from 4 different species, rotating in and out every 6 standard months. They were there to handle security escalations, customs enforcement backup, and the occasional piracy-adjacent situation that cropped up when 2 rival freight companies got their shipping containers confused at 2 in the morning. In practice, they mostly stood around. The garrison was commanded by a Vorindal officer named Submarshal Drex Kale. Tall, broad-shouldered in the way that Vorindal usually are, which is to say very broad-shouldered, with that flat armored brow ridge and the 4-chambered jaw structure that makes them look perpetually displeased. Drex Kale was, and I say this as someone who eventually came to understand him better, a competent officer in a posting that gave him very little opportunity to demonstrate it. He ran a tight unit. His soldiers respected him. His paperwork was always on time. He also had a very particular problem with the human. The human's name was Marcus Vael. He'd arrived on Varath 9 about 3 months before the incident, reassigned from somewhere, the record said, though the details on where were vague in the way that military records sometimes are when someone important doesn't want you looking too closely. He held the rank of auxiliary specialist, which in the GCF structure put him roughly in the middle of the enlisted tier. Not a grunt, not an officer. Somewhere in between, doing a job that the system had decided needed doing. His assignment was perimeter compliance. Basically, he walked the outer docking rings, checked that vehicles and cargo were where they were supposed to be, flagged unauthorized access, and filed reports. Unglamorous work. Work that, in the Vorindal soldiers' estimation, was exactly suited to a species that had only joined the Galactic Assembly 4 standard decades ago. That was the thing about humans in those years. 40 years of membership, in an assembly that had been functioning for 600. They were new, intensely, embarrassingly, almost aggressively new. And the species that had been part of the galactic community for centuries had developed, over those 40 years, a sort of collective habit of looking at humans with a particular expression. Not hostility, exactly. More like the patient indulgence you'd show a child who just discovered something everyone else had known forever. Oh, how exciting. They've learned to use FTL drives, how precious. Marcus Vael walked into that environment and didn't seem to notice it, which was either the most confident thing I'd ever seen or the most oblivious. I genuinely couldn't tell at first. I first saw him on his 3rd day at the station. He was in the main corridor near Bay 11, standing at a cargo scanner terminal, running a freight manifest. He was a medium-height human, which by Theresi standards made him short, I've got about 40 centimeters on most humans, and we're not the tallest species in the assembly either. He had dark hair cut very close to his head, the kind of cut that said military without needing a uniform to say it. Brown skin. A stillness about him that I noticed because it was unusual. Most humans I'd encountered were kinetic creatures, always moving, always gesturing, always filling silence with sound. Marcus Vael stood at that terminal like he was part of the architecture. He was wearing the standard GCF gray and blue uniform, the auxiliary patch on his left shoulder. He had no visible combat insignia, which, combined with the rank and the posting, painted a pretty clear picture. Mid-career. Middle-tier assignment, nothing remarkable. That's what I thought. That's what everyone thought. The mockery started almost immediately. I don't think it began as cruelty. I think it began, if I'm being honest, as the kind of casual group behavior that happens when one group of soldiers has too much downtime and another person makes for an easy focal point. The Vorendal soldiers had a barracks lounge on level 3. They called it the Crater because someone had hung an old tactical relief map of some bombed-out moon on the wall, and it had become a kind of informal mascot for the space. They spent their off hours there, playing strategy games, arguing about GCF policy, doing the things soldiers do when they're bored on a quiet posting. Borendax, one of the Vorendal privates, young, maybe 2 years into his service, the kind of young where you're confident enough to be stupid, started it. He'd seen Marcus in the cafeteria one morning and come back to the Crater with a story about how the human had been eating his meal with a handheld utensil, instead of using the table-mounted multi-tool that was standard equipment in the station cafeteria. He didn't even know how to use it, Borendax said, with the glee of someone who'd found a piece of gossip worth sharing. I had to watch him figure out the grip sequence. It took him 3 tries. There was laughter. Light at first. The kind of laughter that happens because a story lands, not because anyone's particularly invested in it. But then it kept going. The Brannicky Corporal, Solith, added that she'd seen Marcus mispronounce the name of the station's primary docking authority officer, a Quellan named Vross, and that Vross had corrected him in front of a line of freight operators. More laughter. A Grenak trooper named Haldus said he'd watched the human try to operate a standard GCF tactical display in the briefing room and give up after 30 seconds. And so it accumulated. Small observations, small moments, all of them real, all of them taken completely out of context, all of them adding up to a portrait of someone who didn't quite belong, who was new to everything, who was, in the gentle but merciless vocabulary of soldiers on a boring posting, soft. I heard about it through Wheelos, who heard about it from the garrison's admin clerk, a Quellan named Trass. Trass had no particular feelings about it either way. He just liked knowing what was happening in every corner of the station, which is what made him both a very good clerk and a very dangerous person to confide in. What I want to be clear about, what I want to say before I tell you what happened, is that Marcus gave them very little to work with in terms of behavior. He didn't rise to it. He didn't respond. He didn't complain to Drexcale. He didn't seek allies. He didn't do the human thing that I'd seen other humans do in uncomfortable situations, which is to either loudly insist on their own dignity or quietly disappear into themselves. He just kept working. Every day. The perimeter walks, the cargo scans, the compliance reports. He was never late. He was never incomplete. He was, by every measurable standard, doing his job exactly as required and not a single thing more. Which paradoxically made the mockery worse in some ways, because soldiers in garrison love to complain about work. It's a bonding mechanism, shared suffering, shared groaning, the collective performance of being put upon. And Marcus didn't participate in that either. He'd finish a shift, file his report, go to the cafeteria or the bunk room or wherever he went, and that was it. Borendax decided this was because the human had no personality. Drex Kale, for his part, didn't actively participate in the mockery, but he didn't stop it either. And there was something in the way he looked at Marcus in briefings, a particular quality of attention that wasn't quite dismissal, but was definitely not respect, that told you everything about where the sub-marshal's sympathies lay. About 6 weeks in, something changed. Not dramatically, not the kind of thing you'd notice if you weren't paying attention, but I was paying attention, partly because Wheelos had asked me to keep an eye on the garrison situation. We had a quarterly integration assessment coming up, and he wanted to know if there were any personnel friction points worth flagging, and partly because I'd become, without quite meaning to, curious about Marcus Vael. What changed was the docking bay incident. Bay 7. Cargo freighter, Quellen Registry, arrived for a routine customs stop. Standard procedure. Auxiliary personnel do the first pass, check manifests, flag anything unusual, escalate to garrison if needed. Marcus was on that rotation. The freighter captain, a Quellen named Osek, heavy-built, 20 years in the freight trade, the kind of person who treats customs checks as personal insults, had a problem with some of his manifest numbers. Specifically, with the fact that Marcus was flagging a discrepancy between the declared cargo weight and the actual scanned weight. A difference of about 4,000 standard units, which is not nothing. Osek got loud about it. Quellen vocal cords are built for volume in a way that Theresi aren't, and when Osek decided to use that capability, you felt it in your chest. He called the manifest system faulty. He called the scanner faulty. He called the entire customs process bureaucratic harassment designed to extort legitimate freight operators. I was crossing Bay 7 on my way to docking control when this was happening. I stopped, partly because you couldn't not stop. Osek was making enough noise to be heard from the corridor, and partly because I wanted to see how the human handled it. Marcus waited until Osek finished. Then he said, in a voice that was quiet enough that I had to take a few steps closer to hear it, "Captain, the discrepancy is real. I've run the scan twice. I need you to open Container 7 Delta, or I need to escalate this to garrison. Your choice." Osek stared at him. That particular Quellen stare that means I cannot believe you are still talking. Marcus looked back. The stare held for maybe 8 seconds. It felt longer. Then Osek, with all the grace of someone who's lost an argument and knows it but refuses to admit it, opened Container 7 Delta. Inside, packed between approved cargo units, were 11 crates of unlicensed pharmaceutical compounds, the kind that weren't technically illegal in the outer helix but had significant import restrictions and definitely weren't on any manifest. Marcus documented it, tagged the container, and filed for garrison escalation without raising his voice once. I stood there in the bay entrance and felt something I hadn't expected to feel about a mid-tier human auxiliary specialist. Respect. The garrison handled the escalation, and Drex Kale filed the resulting paperwork as a routine customs intercept, which it technically was. The incident found its way into the station's weekly summary report, which I read as part of my logistics coordinator duties, and Marcus's name appeared in it the way names appear in administrative documents, factually, without emphasis. In the crater, the story didn't circulate as a positive. Borendax's interpretation: he got lucky, the scanner flagged it, he just didn't back down when the freighter captain pushed. Haldus agreed. Solith said something more measured, that actually standing your ground against an angry Quellen freight captain wasn't nothing, physically speaking, but the room's consensus was already formed. Lucky, stubborn, still soft. I want you to hold that in mind, because that interpretation, lucky, stubborn, still soft, is going to feel very different by the time I finish telling you what happened in month 3. The station had a training facility on level 4. Standard military-grade equipment, resistance trainers, tactical simulation pods, a small sparring court that the garrison used twice a week for hand-to-hand combat drills. It wasn't open to civilian personnel during garrison drill hours, but there were time slots outside of those hours when auxiliary staff could use it. Marcus used it every morning, early, before the first shift briefing, before the cafeteria filled up, before the station's ambient noise rose to its daytime level. He used it alone. I know this because Trask told me, because Trask knew everything, and because Trask had developed his own mild curiosity about the human that mirrored mine. "He's in there for 90 minutes, Trask said one afternoon, as we stood at the corridor junction near the level 4 entrance. "Every morning, never misses." "What does he do?" "No idea. The facility feed doesn't record during off hours, privacy protocols." Trask clicked his beak, a quelling expression somewhere between a shrug and a raised eyebrow. "But he comes out looking like he's been through something." I filed that away. The thing that really started to change the atmosphere on Vareth 9 wasn't something Marcus did. It was something that arrived. About 10 weeks after Marcus joined the station, we got a transmission from Assembly Command, encrypted, priority flagged, routed directly to Drex Kale's command terminal. I didn't know the contents at the time. I knew there'd been a transmission because these things always leave administrative fingerprints, a burst of encrypted traffic that shows up in the station's communication logs even if the content is sealed. Drex Kale called a closed garrison briefing the next morning. No auxiliary personnel, no civilian staff. The garrison's 4 squad leaders, the sub-marshal and nobody else. It lasted 2 hours. When it ended, Drex Kale looked, and this is Trask's description, not mine, because Trask had eyes everywhere like someone who'd just been told something he didn't know what to do with. Not alarmed, not angry, something more complicated. I didn't find out what was in that transmission for another 3 weeks. When I did find out, I understood everything. Let me tell you about the morning of day 73. By then the mockery had become so routine that it had stopped feeling like mockery and just started feeling like atmosphere, just part of the background noise of the station, like the cargo loaders in Bay 12 or the ventilation hum on Level 2. Borindax's jokes about human incompetence. Haldus's pointed questions in briefings that were designed to give Marcus opportunities to look confused. Even Drex Kale's habit of assigning Marcus to the least operationally interesting perimeter sectors, the ones where nothing happened, where there was no chance to demonstrate anything, had calcified into just how things were. Marcus did not seem to care. I had started, by this point, to wonder if he was simply incapable of being bothered, whether humans generally processed social friction differently from other species, or whether this particular human was unusual even by human standards. I'd worked with human personnel before. The Assembly's civilian staff had a not insignificant human component by then, and most of the humans I'd known had been visibly responsive to the social environment around them. Not Marcus. He had a quality that I eventually came up with a word for: contained, not cold, not withdrawn. Just everything he was stayed inside him, accessible on his terms, invisible on everyone else's. Day 73 started like any other day. It didn't end like one. The crisis came from Bay 4. A passenger liner, the Arvent Meridian big ship, Vorendal Registry, carrying about 400 civilians in transit from the core systems, had docked for a 12-hour layover. Routine stop. The kind that happened a dozen times a week. Passengers disembarked, used the station's transit facilities, reboarded. Nothing complicated. Except one of the passengers wasn't planning to reboard. His name was Grek Asulian. He was a Vorendal national, wanted for financial crimes across 3 systems: fraud, embezzlement, theft on a scale that had produced arrest warrants from the Assembly's Unified Judicial Bureau. He'd apparently been living under a false identification for about 18 months, moving through outer arm systems where documentation checks were less rigorous. He'd made the mistake of booking a liner passage through Verath 9. We didn't know he was on the station until his identification pinged a watch list flag in the transit scanner. The scanner was automated, routine, built into the docking process, and when it flagged him, it sent an alert to station security, which routed it to the garrison. Drex Vael got the alert at 9:14. By that time, Grek Osulian had been on the station for 40 minutes and had disappeared into the transit corridors. The problem with Verath 9, the thing that made this particular situation genuinely difficult rather than just administratively annoying, was its layout. The station had been built in 3 phases over about 40 years, and the result was a maze. Not deliberately, just through the kind of organic sprawl that happens when you keep adding sections without a coherent master plan. Level 2 had corridors that didn't connect to Level 3 in the places you'd expect. Bay Areas 9 through 14 had a whole secondary maintenance network running beneath them that was technically off-limits to civilians, but had never been properly sealed. The transit corridors in the midsection could branch into 4 or 5 directions at a time with minimal signage. If you knew the station well, you could move through it in ways that made you very hard to follow. Grek Osulian had clearly done his homework. Drex Vael deployed his soldiers in a standard containment pattern: cover the primary exits, lock down the docking bays, send teams into the main transit corridors to sweep toward the center. It was the right call for the information he had. He put his 4 best soldiers on the primary pursuit, kept Borendax and 2 others on bay lockdown, and sent word to civilian station staff to shelter in place. He also, almost as an afterthought, I think, the kind of decision you make when you're busy managing a real situation, radioed Marcus Vael and told him to cover the Level 2 maintenance junction. Sector Kilo 4, one of the dead-end areas that the main sweep would eventually reach. A placeholder assignment, a way to account for an auxiliary unit you didn't want underfoot. Cover Kilo 4, Drex Vael said. Stay put, do not engage, confirm. Marcus confirmed. What happened next, I know partly from the station's corridor cameras, and partly from what Marcus himself said afterward, in the debrief, in that quiet voice that gave away nothing. Grek Osulian was good at moving through the station. He'd clearly mapped it in advance, or had someone else's map. He went through the transit corridor junction near Bay 11, doubled back through a maintenance access that should have been locked but had a faulty seal, something that had been on the maintenance queue for about 3 months, and came out in the Level 2 maintenance corridor network. The Level 2 maintenance corridor network that led, if you went far enough along the eastern branch, to Sector Kilo 4. The cameras in Kilo 4 were working. I reviewed the footage afterward many times. There's something about watching an event you were told about from the outside, finally seeing it from the inside, that hits differently than you expect. Marcus was standing at the junction point where the Eastern Maintenance Branch met the Kilo 4 access corridor, not pacing, not checking his equipment, just standing with that quality of stillness I'd noticed from the first day. He had a standard-issue GCF comm unit, a standard-issue sidearm, holstered, the basic kit for an auxiliary specialist on perimeter assignment. He'd been standing there for about 9 minutes when Grek Osulian came around the corner at speed. Osulian was a Vorandal male, which meant he had about 30 centimeters and 40 kilograms on Marcus. He was carrying what the post-incident analysis confirmed was a disruption blade, a close-quarters weapon that's technically prohibited for civilian possession in transit zones, but shows up in the outer arm with uncomfortable regularity. He saw Marcus and didn't stop. He accelerated. I've watched that footage many times. What Marcus did in the next 11 seconds is not what a soft person does. It's not what an untrained person does. It's not what someone who spent 40 years as a species doing nothing remarkable does. But I'm going to tell you about it, and I want to tell you the right way, which means I need to tell you what it looked like from the outside first. From the outside, from the camera angle, from the perspective of someone watching later, it was fast and it was controlled, and it was, in a word, clean. Not the chaotic scramble you'd expect from a mid-tier auxiliary specialist cornered by a larger, armed fugitive. Clean. Like someone who had done something very much like this before, in conditions that were considerably worse, and had reduced the whole process to something their body knew by memory. Asulian got within 3 meters before Marcus moved. When Marcus moved, he moved off the angle of approach, not straight back, not sideways, but at a diagonal that took him out of the blade's primary arc while closing the distance simultaneously. Asulian adjusted, committed to the follow-through, and Marcus was already past it, had the weapon arm controlled, and took Asulian down with a technique I later had a GCF combat instructor describe for me. The instructor said, "That's a disarm and ground from what we call an advanced close-quarters combat syllabus. That syllabus is not taught to auxiliary personnel." I said, "I know." He looked at me. "It's barely taught to garrison infantry." I said, "I know that too." Marcus held Asulian down, one knee, weapon secured, comm unit in his free hand, and radioed Drex Kale. "Auxiliary Vael at Kilo 4, I have your subject, he's restrained. Send a team." That was it, that was the whole transmission. When Drex Kale's team arrived 4 minutes later, Marcus was still there, still in the same position, still holding Asulian with the same comm that he'd brought to a cargo scanner argument with an angry Quellan freighter captain 6 weeks prior. Borindax, who was on the team, later told Trask that he'd stood in that corridor entrance for a moment before he could make himself move forward. That's something about the scene, the stillness of it, the quality of control Marcus was projecting, the absolute lack of anything in his face that suggested this had been difficult, had made him stop. He didn't say that as a story about Marcus's impressiveness. He said it as something he was still trying to process. In the debrief, Drex Kale asked Marcus how he'd known Asulian would come through Kilo 4. Marcus said, "The maintenance breach at Bay 11 was the most efficient route through the secondary network for a subject who'd mapped the station but didn't know which sectors were covered. Kilo 4 was the logical terminus." Drex Kale stared at him. "You deduced that," Drex Kale said. Not a question. Something closer to a check, like he was verifying that what he just heard was what had actually been said. "Yes, Sub-Marshal." "From available information." "Yes." There was a pause. In that debrief room, which I was not in but which Trask was, because Trask had ways of knowing about these things, in that room, Trask said, the silence lasted long enough to be uncomfortable. Then Drex Kale said, "Dismissed." And Marcus left. And Drex Kale sat there for another 10 minutes, according to Trask, not moving, not speaking, just looking at the space where Marcus had been. I went to the training facility that evening. Not during hours. After the shifts ended and the garrison had stood down and the station had settled into its night cycle rhythms. I told myself I was doing a facilities check, which was technically within my logistics coordinator remit. I wasn't doing a facilities check. The facility was empty by that hour. I walked through the sparring court, the simulation pods, the resistance equipment, everything in its place, nothing remarkable. Except near the back of the sparring court, half pushed against the wall, there was a training dummy. The kind used for close quarters practice, with sensors built into it that measure strike force and accuracy. It was an older model, the station's equipment budget wasn't generous, and it had been, over time, subjected to a lot of use. But the wear on this particular dummy was concentrated, very specifically concentrated, in patterns that matched what I just spent the afternoon watching on camera footage from Kilo 4. Someone had been practicing, very specifically, for exactly the kind of scenario that had just played out. Every morning, 90 minutes for 10 weeks. I stood in that training room for a long time. Then I went back to my desk and I wrote in my integration assessment notes, Personnel Friction, Garrison Unit, Auxiliary Specialist M. Vael, Monitor for Escalation. And then I deleted that line and wrote Personnel Dynamic Garrison Unit, Auxiliary Specialist M. Vael, Reassessment Recommended. I don't usually write these things down. Brannicky don't have a strong tradition of personal testimony. We're a species that tends to process things through action rather than narration, and sitting down to write out a sequence of events in detail feels uncomfortable in a way that's hard to articulate. Like wearing a garment that fits but doesn't feel right. But there are events that don't process. Events that sit in you like an embedded fragment, not causing damage exactly, but not going away either. They're just there, changing the angle of everything slightly, making you see things you used to see differently. What happened on Vareth 9 is that kind of event. So I'm writing it down. I want to start by being honest about something that most accounts of this situation probably won't include, because most accounts probably won't be written by people who were in the crater making the jokes. The mockery felt easy. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't something we had to work at. It wasn't something we were pushed into. It was the natural result of a group of soldiers with too much downtime, a new unit member who came from a species with a short track record, and the normal human, or I suppose I should say normal soldier, tendency to find a shared target. Borendak started it, but I participated. I added to it. The story about the pronunciation, which I told as entertainment, which got the response entertainment gets, which made me tell it again in slightly embellished forms over the following days. I'm not saying I was the ringleader. I'm saying I was there, I contributed, and I should own that before I tell you anything else. What I didn't know, and what none of us knew, was what we were pointing our jokes at. 3 weeks before the Kilo 4 incident, Drex Kale received that encrypted transmission from Assembly Command. I found out what was in it the same way most of the garrison found out, which is to say, indirectly, after the fact, in pieces. The transmission contained Marcus Vael's full service record. I want to explain what that means because full service record sounds like a bureaucratic phrase, and what it actually represents is something considerably more than that. In the GCF, service records have tiers. Basic record, everyone has that. It covers your assignments, your rank progressions, your training certifications, your disciplinary history. Extended record, officers and senior NCOs, covers tactical evaluations, performance assessments, formal commendations. And then there's a third tier that doesn't have an official name, that most GCF personnel never encounter in their careers. That is routed exclusively through Assembly Command security channels. Drex Kale had requested it. Or rather, he'd submitted a request through standard channels and Assembly Command had processed it. And what came back was not the basic record of an auxiliary specialist assigned to perimeter compliance on a mid-tier outer-arm station. What came back was something that was, in Drex Kale's own words, which I heard second-hand through Haldis, who heard them from the submarshal's aide, not what I was expecting. Those words, delivered in Drex Kale's precise, controlled Vorendal diction with his particular quality of understated expression, added up to something much heavier than the literal meaning. Drex Kale was not a man easily surprised. He had 18 years of GCF service. He'd commanded units in 3 active engagement zones. He'd seen things. When Drex Kale said he'd received something he wasn't expecting, what he meant was, the record shook him. I want to tell you what was in that record. But first, I want to tell you what I knew about humans before any of this happened, because it matters for understanding how far what came afterward had to travel to reach me. 40 years of Assembly membership, 20 years of active GCF integration. Humans had been in the combined forces for about 2 decades at that point, initially in support and logistics roles, then gradually in operational ones as their military structure integrated with the galactic framework. They were new. By the standards of species like the Vorondel or the Grenak, who'd been fighting wars since before most modern species had developed spaceflight, they were infants. That was the narrative, 40 years new, learning, still finding their footing. What the narrative didn't include, and what nobody had thought to ask about, was what humans had been doing before they joined the assembly. The answer, it turned out, was quite a lot. Marcus Vael was 38 standard years old. He'd enlisted in the human military. The structure is called the Federated Defense Corps, which is what the Earth nations had coalesced around in the decades before assembly contact, at age 19. 19 standard years. His first 4 years were in the FDC's ground forces, standard infantry. Combat deployment in 2 separate regional conflicts, both of which had ended before assembly contact protocols formalized the relationship between Earth and the galactic community, which means that those deployments appear in his record but don't appear in any galactic database, because they happened in a system that wasn't on galactic maps yet. He then transferred to a specialized unit. I'm going to say that again because it's important. He transferred to a specialized unit. In the human military structure, specialized unit is the kind of phrase that does a lot of heavy lifting. It's what you say when you don't want to say what you actually mean, which is, the people in these units are not normal soldiers. They go through selection processes designed to eliminate the vast majority of candidates. They operate in conditions and with mission parameters that regular military units never encounter. They are, in the plainest possible terms, the end result of a species deciding to find out what its most capable individuals can do when given every resource and all the training time they need. Marcus spent 11 years in that unit. 11 years. In human terms, and I've looked at comparative species aging tables since, because this became relevant to me, that's a substantial portion of an adult human lifespan. More than a quarter of the years he'd been alive. Doing work that Drex Kale, who had his own combat history, called not what I was expecting. The record itself, I never read it directly. I'm being honest about that. What I know from fragments, things Drex Kale said to his aide, things the aide said to Haldus, things Haldus said to me. The record was classified at a level that civilian station personnel couldn't access and that most GCF personnel couldn't access either. The fact that Drex Kale could access it at all required assembly command authorization. But the fragments were enough. 14 active operations across 11 years, in theaters ranging from hostile environmental conditions. I'd need a geological brief to fully understand to deep cover insertion missions, where Marcus and small numbers of teammates had operated without support, without extraction guarantee, in environments where the wrong decision meant not coming back. Commendations. Marcus's record had commendations from senior human military officials that, when translated into GCF equivalent terminology, ranked above anything currently serving in Verath 9 garrison. Above Drex Kale's commendations. Above what Drex Kale, 18-year GCF veteran, had accumulated in a career of genuine service. Injuries. The record listed injuries because records always do, and the list was the kind of list that tells you something about the conditions a person has operated in. Not 1 or 2, multiple. Serious ones, the kind that require significant medical intervention, the kind that end careers for most soldiers. Marcus had sustained them, recovered, and returned to service each time. And there was a note, a single administrative notation at the bottom of the active service section, that I think is the piece that hit Drex Kale the hardest, based on the way Haldus described the sub-marshal's expression when he talked about it. The notation said, subject's unit designation and specific operational history remain classified under Assembly Integration Protocol 7, Pending review of interspecies information sharing agreements. Record excerpt provided represents approximately 40% of total service documentation. 40%. What Drex Kale received, that thing that made him sit silently in his office for an extended period, that thing he called not what I was expecting. That was 40% of the actual record. Drex Kale didn't tell us, not directly, not right away. I think he was processing it the same way I processed it later, trying to recalibrate a framework of understanding that had been built on assumptions that turned out to be wrong in a fundamental way. When you build something on a flawed foundation and someone shows you the foundation, you don't fix it in an afternoon. You stand there looking at the crack for a while first. But he changed. Subtle things. The kind of things you notice only in retrospect when you're trying to piece together a timeline. He started actually looking at Marcus in briefings, not the dismissive glance he'd been giving before, but the look you give a piece of information you're not sure what to do with yet. He reassigned one of Marcus's perimeter sectors from the completely inactive Omega block to the slightly less completely inactive Gamma block. Small thing, but the directionality was different. He didn't stop the mockery, but he stopped participating in its ambient atmosphere in the way he had been. He became, in a way that's hard to describe if you haven't observed military command culture closely, neutral. Whereas before his neutrality had functioned as tacit approval, now it started to function as something more genuinely hands-off. I noticed this, I didn't know what it meant. After the Kilo 4 incident, I understood. Let me tell you about the 3 days between Kilo 4 and the moment everything became visible. The incident happened. Asulian was in station custody, awaiting transfer to Assembly judicial personnel. The paperwork was filed. The garrison stood down from alert status. Normal operations resumed. And Marcus Vael went back to his perimeter walks. That's what got me. That's the thing I keep coming back to when I think about those 3 days. He just done something that, and I'm using the word carefully, with full awareness of what it carries, that most of us in that garrison could not have done. Not in that corridor, not with that situation, not with no backup and a disruption blade coming at him and 11 seconds to work with. And he went back to filing cargo compliance reports. He didn't say anything about it in the common areas. He didn't accept the obligatory round of drinks that Haldus awkwardly offered the evening after, not rudely, just a thank you, I'm fine, that closed the door on the performance without slamming it. He didn't change how he moved through the station, how he ate, how he interacted with anyone. The contained quality I'd noticed from the beginning. It wasn't a defense mechanism, I realized. It wasn't something he'd erected to protect himself from us. It was just what he was. It had always been what he was. We'd mistaken it for blankness, for nothing being there. There was quite a lot there. Borindax went quiet. That's the most dramatic change in those 3 days. Borindax, who'd been the social engine of all of it, who'd had something to say about every Marcus-adjacent observation for 10 weeks, Borindax went quiet in a way that wasn't his normal style at all. He'd sit in the crater and not fill the silence. He'd start to say something and stop. I finally asked him what was going on. We were alone in the crater on the second evening, the station cycling into its quiet hours, the cargo loaders in Bay 12 audible even up here through the hull. He said, I've been in the GCF for 2 years. I waited. 2 years, and I've never been in a real situation. A real one, where it actually mattered and you either do it right or something bad happens. I said Kilo 4 mattered. I wasn't at Kilo 4, I was on Bay lockdown. I was standing in front of a sealed door making sure nobody went in or out. He paused. Marcus was in the actual corridor. I didn't say anything. And he just, Borindax shook his head, and in that headshake there was something I recognized from my own processing of the past 48 hours. He just handled it, like it wasn't the first time something tried to kill him in a confined space. "It probably wasn't," I said. Borendax looked at me. "I don't know that," I said. "But I think that's probably true." There was a long silence. "I made a lot of jokes," Borendax said. "Not quite an apology. Something preceding an apology. The part where you acknowledge what the apology needs to cover." "We all did," I said. That didn't make either of us feel better, but it was accurate. The moment everything became visible, the moment the full weight of what we'd been doing, and who we'd been doing it to finally landed on the garrison as a whole, happened on the morning of the fourth day. Drex Kale called a unit assembly, full garrison, all 42 personnel including auxiliary staff in the main briefing room. This was unusual. Full assemblies happened for quarterly reviews and major incident briefings, not on a random morning cycle 3 days after an event that had already been formally debriefed. Marcus came in with the rest of the auxiliary staff. He sat toward the back of the room, which was just where the auxiliary seating was, nothing pointed about it. He had his standard posture, straight, contained. Drex Kale stood at the front, in full dress configuration, which was also unusual for an internal briefing. He had his decorations on, and Drex Kale had respectable decorations, the result of 18 years of genuine GCF service, visible confirmation that the sub-marshal's credentials were real. He looked at the room for a moment, long enough that people who'd been fidgeting stopped fidgeting. Then he said, "I'm going to tell you something that I've been sitting with for approximately 3 weeks, and that the events of 4 days ago have made it impossible for me to continue to sit with privately." Total quiet. Even the cargo loaders seemed far away. 3 weeks ago, I requested the service record of Auxiliary Specialist Marcus Vael. That request was processed by Assembly Command Security. What came back was, he paused, and I'd never seen Drex Kale pause mid-sentence before. He always knew what he was going to say before he said it. Instructive. He looked at Marcus. "I'm not going to read out a classified record in an unsecured briefing room," he said. "What I am going to say is this. The assumptions this unit has been operating under regarding Auxiliary Specialist Vael's background, capability, and history are incorrect. Not partially incorrect. Not in need of minor revision." Another pause. "Completely incorrect. You could have dropped something fragile in that room and watched it fall in absolute silence. The specific nature of the specialist's prior service is classified at a level above this unit's clearance. What I am authorized to tell you is the following. He served for 11 years in a specialized human military unit, whose operational record, even at 40% declassification, contains more active engagements, more commendations for exemplary performance in life-threatening situations, and more documented evidence of exceptional capability than the combined records of every person currently serving in this room, including myself." He let that land. It landed. 4 days ago, this unit failed to contain a priority-flagged fugitive, who successfully evaded our main sweep through known station vulnerabilities. That fugitive was located and neutralized by Auxiliary Specialist Vael, operating alone, armed with a standard sidearm that he did not draw, using hand-to-hand techniques that are not part of the auxiliary training syllabus, because they are not generally considered teachable in the time available for auxiliary training. Drex Kale's jaw tightened slightly. Because they require years of specialized development to perform at the level demonstrated in that corridor. Marcus was looking at the middle distance, not at Drex Kale, not at any of us, somewhere neutral. "I am speaking now," Drex Kale said, "as the commanding officer of this unit, to address a pattern of conduct within this garrison that I should have addressed 3 weeks ago, when I first received information that made that pattern untenable. The mockery of Auxiliary Specialist Vael, which has been present in this unit since his arrival, and which I permitted by failing to prevent it, was wrong. It was wrong on grounds of basic unit conduct. It was wrong on grounds of factual ignorance. And it was wrong on grounds of basic dignity, which applies regardless of any other consideration. He looked around the room slowly, taking in faces. I am issuing a formal unit correction. This ends. Questions? Nobody asked any. After the assembly dismissed, I found myself in the corridor outside the briefing room, not quite sure how I'd gotten there or what I was supposed to do next. People were moving around me, returning to their posts, and there was a quality to the movement that I recognized as the physical expression of a group of people trying to figure out what they thought and feeling. Haldus stopped next to me. He was staring at his boots. 40%, he said. I knew what he meant, the 40% notation. The record Drex Kale had received was 40% of the total. Yeah, I said. How many years of actual service does a person accumulate before they end up with a classified record that big? I didn't answer because I didn't have an answer. I just stood there, letting the question sit in the air between us. Marcus walked out of the briefing room. He saw us. He didn't look away. He didn't look through us either. He looked at us directly, a look that had no triumph in it, no anger, no residual bitterness from 10 weeks of being on the receiving end of jokes from people who had no idea what they were looking at. He nodded. It was the nod you give someone in a corridor, brief, neutral, acknowledging existence. And then he walked to his next assignment. I requested a transfer off Vareth 9 6 weeks later, not because of Marcus, nothing like that. The transfer had been in process before any of this happened, a standard rotation request. It came through and I took it. On my last day, I was in the cafeteria finishing my morning meal when Marcus came in. He got his food, and for a moment he stood in that way he had, surveying the room, deciding where to sit, and then he came and sat across from me. We ate in silence for a bit. Then he said, "Leaving today?" "Yes," I said. He nodded. I wanted to say something. I'd been trying to figure out for weeks what the right thing to say was, whether apology was the right register, whether acknowledgement was more appropriate, whether there was any way to address 10 weeks of casual cruelty that didn't sound hollow. I said, "For what it's worth, I'm sorry." He looked at me. Those human eyes, which are expressive in a different way than Brannicky eyes, less in the iris, more around the whole structure of the face. He looked at me with a quality that I couldn't entirely read. Then he said, "It was a bad posting for all of us. People find things to do with that kind of restless energy." A pause. I didn't take it personally. I sat with that for a moment. "You didn't take it personally," I said, "or you decided not to." He looked at me for a moment longer. Then something happened at the edge of his mouth, not quite a smile, but in the direction of one. "Something like that," he said. And he went back to his meal. I kept thinking about that conversation for a long time, the precision of that answer, something like that. Not "I decided not to," which would have been a performance. Not denial. Something true that he wasn't required to share all of and chose to share just enough of. A contained person, giving out exactly what he wanted to give and not one unit more. It occurred to me, on the transport away from Vareth 9, sitting in a window seat watching the station reduce to a shape and then to nothing in the black, that Marcus Vael was probably the most disciplined person I'd ever met. And that I'd spent 10 weeks calling him soft. I've written official reports for most of my life. You spend 18 years in the GCF command structure, and you develop a relationship with documentation that's somewhere between professional habit and compulsive need. Everything gets filed. Everything gets quantified. Incident report, debrief summary, unit assessment, commendation request, disciplinary notation. The vocabulary of formal record-keeping becomes so embedded in how you think that it starts to infect your private thought as well. You catch yourself composing incident reports in your head about things that happen to you personally. Your brain sorts experience into standardized sections. Date, time, summary of events, conclusions, recommendations. This is not one of those documents. What I'm going to write here is what I actually remember, in the way I actually remember it, without the structure that official documentation imposes. Because official documentation has limits. It captures what happened but not what it meant. It records conclusions but not the process of arriving at them, which is sometimes the more important thing. What I'm writing here is about a human named Marcus Vael, and about what it taught me, what it cost me in a way to understand who he was. I want to start with the request for the record. 3 weeks before the Kilo 4 incident, I submitted a service record request for Marcus Vael through Assembly Command channels. I've thought about my reasons for doing that many times since, and I want to be precise about what actually motivated it, because the version I sometimes tell myself is cleaner than the truth. The clean version. I was a thorough commanding officer doing due diligence on a new unit member. The true version. I did it because of the cargo scanner incident at Bay 7. I'd received Trass's debrief note on the incident, standard clerk notification of anything requiring garrison escalation, and something in the note had snagged at me in a way I couldn't quite articulate. Not the incident itself, which was routine. The manner of it. The way Marcus had reportedly handled OSEC's escalation, the quiet holding of position, the clean ultimatum, the complete absence of performance in either direction. It matched something I'd seen in officers with considerably more experience than an auxiliary specialist should have. It didn't match the picture that Borendax and the others had been painting in the crater, which I'd been allowing to paint itself without intervention. I submitted the record request because I wanted to resolve a discrepancy. The picture and the behavior didn't line up. I wanted to know why. I wasn't prepared for the answer. The record arrived in 2 parts. The first part was the standard GCF auxiliary service file. 2 years of auxiliary enrollment since human GCF integration reached the point where individual personnel transfer was possible. Training certifications, all standard level, nothing above auxiliary syllabus, exactly what you'd expect. His assignment history. 3 postings before Verath 9, all outer arm stations, all compliance and perimeter work. Conduct record, clean. Performance evaluations, satisfactory across the board. The document was completely, thoroughly, deliberately unremarkable. The second part was what Assembly Command added after processing the full request. 11 pages. Classified header. Assembly Integration Protocol 7. And then the service history of a person who, on the basis of those 11 pages, should not have been standing in a perimeter compliance posting on an outer arm station. I read those 11 pages 3 times, sitting at my command terminal in my office with the door locked. 3 times because the first time I thought I was misreading something, and the second time I thought there might be an error in the file, and the third time I had to accept that there was no error and I was reading it correctly. What I want to tell you about, because it's the thing I still think about most, the piece that reorganized something in how I understood the situation, is not the commendations, not the operations, not the injury record, though that was its own education. It was the operational environments. One of the things a classified operational record includes, for personnel who have operated in the 3rd-tier classification category, is an environmental summary. Where they went, under what conditions, not specific mission details, those stay sealed even within the classified tier, but the categories of environment, because those categories have tactical and medical relevance for subsequent assignments. Marcus Vael's environmental summary covered 14 operational theaters. I will tell you what I recognized from that list, because I've served in some environments worth describing. He'd operated in atmospheric conditions that the GCF rates as extreme hostile, which means conditions where standard GCF environmental suits provide insufficient protection and specialized equipment is required, multiple times, as a standard operating parameter for his unit, not as an exceptional circumstance. He'd operated in what the document called isolated insertion conditions, meaning small unit, no extraction guarantee, communications restricted or absent, operating in territory where support could not reach them in useful timeframes. This was a category for him. It wasn't a crisis. It was a mission profile. He'd operated in conditions I'll summarize as against numerically superior opposition, which is a phrase that sounds straightforward and becomes considerably less so when you look at the outcome notations, which universally describe mission objectives achieved. And there was one environmental notation I want to call out specifically, because it crystallized something for me in a way nothing else in the file did. It said, duration tolerance, extended isolation operations of 30-plus standard days documented on X occasions. The X was a number I'm not going to reproduce here because I'm not certain of my authorization to do so, but it was not 1, and it was not 2. 30 days or more. Alone or with a small team in hostile environments, with no extraction guarantee, completing objectives. I sat in my office and I thought about Marcus Vael standing at a cargo scanner terminal in Bay 7, running a freight manifest, alone, in the quiet, with absolute stillness. And I thought he's resting. That was what I thought. Not he's being antisocial, or he has no personality, or any of the things the garrison's ambient narrative had constructed. He's resting. He'd spent 11 years in conditions of sustained, severe intensity, and now he was in a quiet outer arm posting doing work that required almost nothing of him, and he was resting, in the way that a person who has lived at a particular pitch for a very long time rests when they finally get a moment to. The stillness I'd noticed, that Borendax had noticed, that everyone had read as absence. It wasn't absence. It was recovery. It was a person who had learned to be very, very quiet when quietness was available, because they'd spent years in environments where quietness was not. I kept the record to myself for 3 weeks. I've asked myself many times why I waited that long. The honest answer is that I wasn't ready, which is an uncomfortable thing to admit for someone who prides himself on decisiveness and clear action. But the record required me to restructure how I understood the situation in my garrison, how I understood my own conduct as a commanding officer, and how I understood the relationship between what I thought I knew about Marcus Vael and what was actually true. That restructuring took 3 weeks. I'm not proud of how long it took. I include it here because honesty requires it. The Kilo 4 incident happened during those 3 weeks. I want to tell you what it was like to receive that radio transmission. Marcus's voice. Auxiliary Vael at Kilo 4, I have your subject. He's restrained. Send a team. I was in the command center, running the sweep coordination. I deployed the garrison in what I believed was a competent containment pattern. I'd put my best personnel on primary pursuit. I'd assigned Marcus to a dead-end sector because, in the moment, I'd been operating on 2 competing mental models simultaneously. The record, which I was still processing, and the garrison's accumulated narrative, which had been in place for 10 weeks, and the narrative won in the real-time decision. I sent my best people after Ausulian. I sent Marcus to stand in a corridor where I didn't expect anything to happen. He found the subject, alone, without a drawn weapon, without support. When his transmission came through, there was a moment, and I'm being precise here, because precision is how I process things, even the uncomfortable things, where I felt something I don't have a clean word for. It was a combination of relief that the subject had been found and something else. Something about the fact that the right thing had happened in spite of my decision-making, not because of it. That I'd accidentally put the right person in the right place by treating him as irrelevant. I told the team to move to Kilo 4. Then I sat in the command center for a moment and looked at the communication panel. Then I went back to running the post-incident coordination, because that's what commanding officers do. But the moment was there, I cataloged it, I took it apart later. The debrief happened an hour after the team arrived at Kilo 4. Standard post-incident protocol. I asked Marcus about his reasoning. He explained it: the maintenance breach, the root analysis, the logical terminus. Clean, sequential, exactly how you describe a tactical assessment. I asked, "You deduced that?" He said, "Yes, Sub-Marshal." And then I said something that I've replayed many times, "from available information." And he said, "Yes." What I was actually doing in that moment was checking. Not his reasoning, I could follow his reasoning, it was clear and valid. I was checking whether I was understanding correctly that he had done what I thought he'd done, which was perform a real-time tactical analysis of a moving situation using only information available in the environment, and arrive at a correct conclusion, and position himself accordingly, and execute a physical response that I'd now seen. The footage demonstrated capabilities not present in the auxiliary training syllabus. All of that, alone in a dead-end corridor, assigned there because I decided he was irrelevant. I said dismissed and he left, and I sat in that room for, I think it was about 10 minutes, though I can't be certain looking at the door. I was thinking about something the environmental summary had said: isolated insertion conditions, no extraction guarantee, mission objectives achieved. What Marcus Vael had done in Kilo 4 corridor was, by those standards, entirely routine. A confined space encounter with an armed and larger opponent, one-on-one. No backup. Outcome controlled. Objective achieved. Routine. I'd sent him there because I thought nothing would happen. He'd been there before. Not in that specific corridor, not with that specific fugitive, but in that fundamental shape of situation. Many times. While the rest of us were managing what we considered a serious incident from a place of genuine stress, he'd handled the actual moment of danger with his body and his training, and his very long memory of being in dangerous moments. I want to talk about the assembly, because it was the most difficult thing I did on Verath 9, and probably one of the more difficult things I've done in my career. The easy thing, the thing that's tempting when you're a commanding officer who's realized you've made a significant error, is to quietly correct course without explicitly acknowledging what you're correcting. Tighten things up, redirect behavior, let the implied message do the work. Nobody has to say anything directly. The culture shifts, and you maintain the appearance of having always been in control of the situation. I decided not to do that. I decided not to because that approach, while protecting my command authority in the short term, would have been a form of dishonesty, institutional dishonesty, the kind that's easy to rationalize and corrosive over time. My garrison had engaged in sustained mockery of a personnel member. I had permitted it. The information I now held made that conduct not only wrong in terms of basic dignity, which it had always been, but revealed in its full absurdity. We'd been mocking someone who had spent 11 years doing things most of us could not imagine. Dignity grounds were sufficient for the correction. I didn't need the classified record for that. But the record was real, and what it contained was real, and pretending it didn't exist while quietly hoping behavior would improve was not something I could justify to myself. So I told them what I could tell them. I stood in that briefing room in full dress configuration, which I chose deliberately, because the configuration signals that what's being communicated is formal and consequential, and I said what was true. The mockery was wrong. The assumptions were wrong. The record was, to the extent I could describe it within authorization, significant, and I had failed to prevent the conduct I was now correcting. The last part was harder to say than I expected. I'd known I was going to say it. I'd decided to say it before I walked into the room. But knowing you're going to say something and actually saying it in front of 42 people are different experiences. Nobody spoke, Nobody asked questions after the dismissal. Marcus didn't react, not visibly, not during the assembly. He sat in the back of the room with his standard posture and looked at the middle distance and was whatever he was inside without letting any of it come out. Later, I thought about what that must have required. The restraint of sitting in a room while your commanding officer formally acknowledged that the unit had been wrong about you and you'd been right, and not letting anything show. Not satisfaction, not vindication, nothing. That's a particular kind of discipline. The kind that's very hard to manufacture and very easy to spot when it's real. In the weeks after the assembly, things changed on Verath 9. Not dramatically, not in the way that stories sometimes describe change, the big reversal, the new warmth, the reconciliation scene. Real change in group dynamics doesn't work like that. It's slower and more awkward and punctuated by silences that aren't quite comfortable yet. What I observed was something more modest. Borindak's going quiet, I knew about that. The crater's social dynamics were something I kept track of, and the change in his behavior was noticeable. Haldis beginning to actually include Marcus in briefing conversations rather than using them as opportunities for pointed condescension. Solith requesting a transfer, a decision I respected and processed without comment. And Marcus continuing to do his job, filing his reports, walking his perimeter, using the training facility every morning for 90 minutes, which I knew about from the facility logs and which I now read with a completely different understanding than I would have had 6 weeks prior. I made one decision that I didn't explain, and I want to explain it here because I think it matters. About 3 weeks after the assembly, I submitted a recommendation to Assembly Command, not a record request, a recommendation. It was addressed to the human military liaisons who oversee the GCF integration program, and it concerned the assignment of a specific personnel member to a role that more accurately reflected his documented capabilities. I don't know if anything came of it. I left Verath 9 before any response would have reached the station, and by the time my next posting was established, I had other operational concerns. I never saw Marcus Vael again after I shipped out. But I wrote it. I wrote it because it was the right thing to do, and because there's a limit to how much you can correct a situation from the inside of it, and because someone with Marcus's record was wasted on perimeter compliance in Sector Kilo 4, and I had the standing to say so to people who might do something about it. Whether they did, I don't know. There's a moment I've thought about more than any other in the events of Verath 9, more than the assembly, more than reading the record, more than watching the Kilo 4 footage. It was small. It happened 2 days after the assembly in the main corridor near Bay 11. I was on a walk through. I did regular facility walks, partly habit, partly the need to move when I was processing something. Marcus was coming the other direction, finishing a perimeter check. We passed each other in the corridor. He stopped, I stopped. We faced each other. I said, "Specialist." He said, "Sub-Marshal." There was a beat, not an awkward one exactly. More like a moment of acknowledgement that the previous several weeks had created a context that ordinary corridor greetings don't normally carry. I said, the Kilo 4 response was well executed. This was, I want to be precise about what this was. It was not effusive praise. It was not an attempt to balance out weeks of neglect with a moment of generosity. It was a professional assessment, offered directly, which is the appropriate vehicle in a military context for communicating something you genuinely mean. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you, Sub-Marshal." And then, the sweep was well run. If the Bay 11 SEAL had been in order, the primary teams would have had him. I looked at him. The Bay 11 SEAL was a maintenance failure, 3 months on the queue, never addressed, ultimately the gap through which Asulian had moved. It was not my failure exactly. Maintenance was civilian administration, not garrison. but as the senior military officer on the station, the failure of containment was mine to account for. And Marcus was, in that one sentence, giving me something. Acknowledging that the tactical plan had been sound, that the gap had been a structural failure rather than a command failure, that the outcome could reasonably have been different with better maintenance oversight. He didn't have to do that. He had no obligation to do that. He did it anyway. I said, "I'll note it in the maintenance report." He said, "Yes, Sub-Marshal." And we both continued our respective walks. I made it about 20 meters down the corridor before I stopped and stood there for a moment, facing the direction we'd both come from. Something like grace, I thought. Not forgiveness. He hadn't been wronged by the maintenance failure, and the word didn't quite fit the shape of what he'd done. Something in the neighborhood of grace. The choice to give something to someone who hadn't necessarily earned it. A contained person, still inside everything, controlled, precise. And then occasionally, when he decided to, giving out just enough of the real thing to remind you it was there. 14 years later. I'm retired. My knees have opinions about stairs that my younger self wouldn't recognize. I have a consulting arrangement with the GCF's Outer Arm Strategic Review Board, which means I read reports and occasionally write recommendations, which is still more comfortable to me than most other ways of spending time. I think about Vareth 9 sometimes, about the lessons it taught me in forms I wasn't expecting. I think about the assumption problem, the way a group of people, reasonably intelligent people, trained soldiers, individuals with their own histories of competence and legitimate service, can construct a framework of understanding around another person that is completely wrong, and then fortify that framework against incoming information, because the framework has social uses. It explained something. It gave the group cohesion, a shared reference point. The cost of maintaining it was paid by Marcus, who was there every day having his competence reduced to a punchline by people who had, collectively, not yet done a single thing he'd been doing for over a decade. The information problem. The way the Galactic community had been looking at humans through the lens of 40 years of assembly membership, without thinking carefully about the question of what happened before. Every species comes to the Galactic table with a history. The Vorondal's history includes 600 years of organized warfare and the development of military traditions that are genuinely formidable. We are proud of that. We talk about it. We're in the GCF partly because of it. The idea that a species with 40 years of assembly membership might have its own military history, different from ours, developed in isolation, shaped by a different set of pressures, and producing people like Marcus Vael, simply hadn't occurred to me as something worth investigating until Base 7 made me uncomfortable enough to look. That's on me, fully. And the recognition problem. The way records, even classified ones, are a reduction, the 40% notation. Whatever I read was 40% of what actually happened, and what I read was already enough to change the room when I described it at the assembly. 60% is still sealed, waiting for whatever interspecies information-sharing agreements haven't been resolved yet. And Marcus himself, walking the perimeter of Vareth 9, carrying all of it in his body and his stillness and his 90-minute morning sessions in the training facility, was the full 100%, none of which was visible unless you knew how to look. We didn't know how to look. Most of us, for most of the time we had with him, weren't even trying. I'm going to end this account with something that isn't an analysis, not a lesson or a conclusion or a recommendation, just a fact. I've served under and alongside some genuinely capable officers and soldiers in 18 years of GCF service. People who were brave in ways that cost them something, or skilled in ways that had taken a lifetime to develop, or wise in ways that made the people around them better at their work and their lives. I've been fortunate in that regard. The GCF, for all its institutional imperfections, produces people worth knowing. Marcus Vael was, in my professional assessment, carrying all the weight that phrase implies from 18 years of forming professional assessments, among the most capable individuals I have encountered. I don't say this because of the combat record, though the record speaks clearly enough. I say it because of what I observed over 3 months on a quiet outer arm station, watching a person who had every reason to demonstrate his capability, to let us see what we were dismissing, to correct the record through behavior that made our assumptions obviously wrong, watching that person simply not bother. He didn't need us to know. He didn't need our recognition to know what he was. The work was enough. The perimeter walks, the cargo checks, the training facility every morning. He was what he was, independent of whether we saw it, and he was going to keep being it regardless. That's the kind of person you spend a career hoping to understand. That's the kind of person who teaches you something by making you realize the size of what you got wrong. 40 years of assembly membership. That's what we kept saying. 40 years new to all of this, still learning. What we didn't say, what we weren't saying even to ourselves, was the question we should have started with. New to the galaxy, maybe. But what else were they before we found them? What had they been doing with all that time in the dark, alone, before we arrived? What had they been building? What had they been becoming? And who had they made, in the generations of struggle that we hadn't witnessed, the conflicts we had no records of, the long history of a species surviving everything it had to survive to get from wherever they started to the point where they looked up at the stars and figured out how to reach them? Who was Marcus Vael? The question I should have asked on day one, sitting across from a quiet man running a freight manifest with absolute stillness, was not, what has he done in the 40 years since we found him? It was, who is he from the thousands of years before? I think about that corridor, Kilo 4, 11 seconds. And I think we were always meeting the answer. We just didn't know the question yet.